So I want to show you a couple examples of pen and ink in context. So these are a couple of renderings I did, and then I scanned in and ended up painting them digitally. But the ink does a lot of the work for me. So you can see on this one I used a lot of that wavy lines and some of the contour lines to create the texture of this piece. And almost like the scribbly lines down at the bottom, but around the neck shaping, it's more of like a combination of the contour and parallel lines in order to create the roundness and depth there. So you can sort of see how I've kept that motion like it's wrapping around the person. And then here I used some cross hatching to create the feeling of this like rough woven fabric, as well as some of the wavy lines and parallel lines to build up the skin, and wavy lines and contour lines through the clothing to give that like drape and softness that I wanted to portray in it. So these are done with a lot of parallel lines, but also a lot of stippling you'll see throughout it, which is kind of to help you realize that this is like a wool, it's a chunky fabric, textile that we're working with. And then there's some scribble lines in places of like wear and tear or like less neat. So it's not so structured. Now on this one, we're gonna actually look at how you could apply watercolor over the ink once it's done. So there's a lot of parallel lines running through the skirt because it's a very structured, very like stiff textile fabric that I wanted this to be built out of. I didn't want a lot of drape to it, so you can kind of see that. But then around the bodice, there's a little bit more of our contour lines and some stippling in order to show you that that fit is a little softer. So when you have this much line work down, this much ink work, these were for Pinocchio, as you can see, so it was sort of based on it being more like a storybook stylized. So that's why I leaned into the ink work for this particular production. But when you have that much ink work, it's doing a lot of the depth for you. It's giving you a lot of the shaping in 3D already. So then when you go in to do your actual watercolor, your coloring of it, you don't have to be as, there's not as much work there for you. It also creates kind of a guide. As I'm applying paint, I can see where I already, put the light. Always make sure that you use the same lighting source when you're painting as you did when you were inking. Being daring and keeping my palette on the opposite side from my dominant painting hand, just so you can see what colors I'm mixing. But it does increase the likelihood I'll drip on my painting, but I think we'll be okay. So I've added a little depth of color into this one, just a touch to really support the ink work that's already there, but you can see it already is kind of coming up off the page. It has that kind of storybook illustration feeling that I was looking for at the time. Now the skirt has less, it has some wide open spaces in it. It's not heavily inked throughout, it's just along the edges and the outskirts, pun intended. But you can see how quickly, with just a little bit of color, this already feels very much like it's coming to life. It has a sense of depth to it. I would still probably push these colors a lot farther if I were painting it for real. In the version that it was done digitally, it had a lot more saturation stuff to it. But I want you to be able to see the line work through on this one and just sort of see how adding the line work before you paint could give you a really nice guide. As you're painting through, you can find everything, you know where it is, you've already discovered your light source, and it's a very controlled way of doing it. So I'm just still adding a little bit of shadows, adding my blue tones to help it recede and to give me some space, but I love that like bright highlight that's running right in the same place that the ink left open. And then I accidentally covered that highlight, so I'm going to soak it with some water and then pick it up with one of my rags to bring that highlight back again. This is just a real quick like glazing of colors over it, but you can start to see really how the ink work, when you add the paint on top of it, guides you, but also starts to really blend in with the paint to become one very unified piece. I like dabbing like this when I'm adding kind of darker highlights or darker shadows because it creates a really nice soft edge. Realized I forgot to do this little cuff here. So that's the benefit of doing the inking first, is that it gives you a lot of control. It becomes more of like making sure you get your local colors in and some shadows and some highlights, but like the shaping, a lot of it is done for you. It can look a little outlined. These I think are, I mean, they're more leaning into being heavily outlined because of the style that I was going for. So they can feel a little stiff if you entirely ink everything in like this. So we're going to show you, I'm going to hop onto this demo that we've done previously, right? And show you kind of what adding ink on top of the watercolor can look like. This can look a little bit more organic. You're picking and choosing where it goes. So I like to start by adding ink in anywhere there's a deep, deep shadow. So I pick like my darkest shadow and maybe bloom from there so that it kind of comes out of that shadow place and then breaks up as it moves out from it. The goal here is not to outline everything. It's just to support our shadows, to give some extra depth, and to add any texture that we feel like we're needing. So I chose to come from where this, I don't know, the hasp of the lock is against this deep crack, because that's got to be our, deepest shadow in the whole piece. I'm using it very sparingly as I go around the lock. You can see I'll do a little bit of line work as I go up and over the loop of the lock. Sort of the line work follows it. I'm using that contour parallel line trick to help add the feeling of that being like one smooth continuous thing, but still add shading and rust texture. Down below I'm going to work more on like stippling to add into our already created kind of stipple textures. Just one more layer. But it's really about picking and choosing just the right spots to have a little bit of ink, and not just outlining everything. In real life, things don't have really bright outlines, And hopefully a lot of your work with the paint, creating different values next to each other in contrast, has built your edges up enough that you don't need to outline everything. So, like I said, I'm sticking to shadow places, doing a little stippling, adding just a couple spots for detail and for depth, and to make sure that like in areas where we have like dark next to dark, that you can still see what's going on. So ink is a nice way to differentiate when things are close to the same value. I'm also going to deepen the crack underneath where the lock is. And I'm going to use the line work. I want a shadow underneath it and to help it recede, but I'm keeping the line work in rhythm and shape the same as we did the wood grain so that it feels like it fits right in, it goes in the same world. So sort of long, organic, interrupted, wavy strokes. And they can kind of peter out. So that's one way you can start to add some ink to it. I want to show you over here what those strokes look like, maybe where you can see them clearer, where I'm letting, the paper peek through and using pressure to determine the depth.